Hello, BookTube. The subject came up the other day on BookTube about the idea of being well read uh, and whether or not it's an attainable thing, or if the list just keeps growing the more you explore it. Uh, and I pushed back a little against the idea at the time, uh, trying to make a distinction that I've been trying to make to readers my whole life, which is that there's a big difference between being well read and being widely read, and that there is no end to being widely read. There's always some new author and some new study of some kind or other that's worthwhile that you haven't got to, and not to mention the language barrier. Uh, but in terms of being well read, in terms of having the basics of your literary tradition at your fingertips, I want to stress that that's not in any way impossible, and it's also not the province of academia. It doesn't have to be. I don't know how many young people I've met, or even middle-aged people, who would, 2 cups of wine in, would get a sort of dreamy look on their face and say, someday I'm going to take my job down to halftime and go back to school and take some classes to really learn about all the stuff that I didn't learn the first time through. And I always tell those people, there's no reason for you to do that. That you can do it on your own. It's actually not that intimidating, and it doesn't take that much time. But the question is, how to start and how to do it, how to go through with it. And I thought I would make a little series of videos on that, because I've helped a lot of people do that, and I'd be happy to help any of you who might be interested in doing that. But I wanted to preface any kind of series like that, whether we continue with this or not, with 3 sort of ground rule observations. The first and most important of which is that there's no wrong way to enjoy reading. You can be a committed, absolutely voracious and passionate reader without caring a bit about anything else, about the literary tradition or anything else. And your enjoyment of what you're reading isn't going to be any less for that fact. And nobody should tell you that it is. But nevertheless, ground rule number 2, although there's no wrong way to enjoy reading, there is a right and wrong way to pursue reading, if you really want to dig into it. The wrong way is haphazard, of course, as is true with anything, right? That's why people have the urge to go back to school to learn this sort of thing. Not because they think school is the sole place where you can learn something, but because school implies logic and system that will be imposed on what they're learning, which, you don't need a moment's reflection to realize that is the right way to learn something. To go deeper into something is to have a system in place. And for that, well, the system is fairly obvious. You don't actually need to go to school to do it. And the reason that it's obvious is because all literature is linear. Nobody learns to write before they learn to read. So all writing is indebted to the writing that went before it, whether the writer or the book or the literary movement really knows it or not. So the way to pursue reading, if you're interested in doing that, the way to pursue reading in order to become well read is to start at the beginning and move forward. That sounds very boring. But that leads us to the ground rule number 3, which is that when we're talking in this little series, if it becomes a series, what we're talking about here is the Western canon. There is no alternate canon, and for the purposes of these videos, I'm of course not going to get into any ideas about privilege or patriarchy or anything like that. I'm talking about the most influential works of Western literature. And I'm talking about them specifically in terms of their influence, because that will affect the things you read that come later. And with those ground rules out of the way, of course, you can see it coming, right? I mean, we can talk all we want about the Epic of Gilgamesh, but when we're talking about going back to the beginning and studying the greatest works of the Western canon, we're talking about the Bible as a place to start. There are 2 places to start. The Bible is one of them. Now, in my life, I have seen that there are 2 main obstacles to people studying the Bible as a work of literature, even reading the Bible as a work of literature. The first obstacle is that they can't help but think of it as a religious text. And the second obstacle is they can't help but think of it as a religious text. Either they go into it looking at it as inspired by some sort of supernatural deity, or they go into it hating the fact that other people look at it that way. And for the purposes of this series, both of those ideas have to be just abandoned. You have to read the Bible as literature. You have to divorce it completely from religion. It can't that can't be a question that enters into it. It will fatally muddy everything. But we will dispense with Gilgamesh. I hardly urge you to read some modern version of Gilgamesh. It's all fragments and completely untranslatable, so it doesn't matter which fragment. Just pick one and see what you think. It's a thing that'll take you half an hour. But the Bible is a big thing, and not as big as you would think. Because, of course, when we talk about the Bible, we're talking about many books, not just one. It's really a library assembled over almost 2,000 years and half the Mediterranean world by dozens and dozens of authors, none of whom knew each other, and all of whom had ulterior motives. There was no, again, you have to, if you're of a religious mind frame, you have to divorce yourself from the idea that there is one superintending mind writing this whole thing as a unit. That simply isn't true. Not only internally, where vast amounts of the books that are in the Bible contradict each other explicitly in ways that you have to abandon logic to reconcile, but also literarily, historically. We know a huge amount about the epistemology of how these different books got into the finished product that we now think of as the Bible. You have to abandon that completely. Instead, what we want to do for the purposes of this first part of a Western Canon starter kit is to go at the Bible as a work of literature. And because we want to do that, large chunks of it don't need to be read. So you look at this big book on your shelf, naturally you might be intimidated. And I want to help with that. So I've taken the liberty of drawing up a list. I admit, I've drawn this list up many times of the books of the Bible, the parts of the Bible that you should read. That you can read the whole thing if you want, but these are the things that cast the longest shadow in literature. And the list is this. There's Genesis, Exodus, there's the book of Joshua and Judges and Ruth. There's first and second book of Samuel, first and second book of Kings, first and second book of Chronicles. There's Job, there's Ecclesiastes, there's the book of Isaiah, there's the Song of Solomon, there's the book of Daniel, then there's the New Testament, the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Epistles of St. Paul. Now, I did some checking with my Oxford King James Bible and my Penguin King James Bible, and those books together without anything else don't take that long to read. So there you go. You look at that page count, that's no more than a 200-page book. You look at that page count, all of a sudden the intimidation factor is gone, and it should be. People have been reading this stuff forever. It's meant to be read. So, although plenty of people died. Plenty of people died on the strength of that proposition, but that's a ranty video for another time. So the key, obviously, isn't that you read these things, because the reading of it is not that hard. All of a sudden, it looks very doable. No, the key is you have to know these things. You have to be familiar with them. So it's not just a question of reading them. You have to reread them. You have to read about them. You have to see various adaptations. Read maybe bunches of people's opinions of them, reactions to them. Read them until you possess them is the key. Those books. And think about them. And parse out what they mean and the stories involved in them. And to the recommendation that I want to make, the parting recommendation I want to make for those books is the version of the Bible that you read. And of course, some of you might be thinking, well, of course he's going to recommend the King James Bible, which has been called one of the greatest feats of translation from any language into any other language that's ever happened, and I agree with that. It's an absolute marvel of sustained Elizabethan prose. But I don't actually recommend it in this case, because the whole point of this little series is to stress that you don't need to devote your whole life to doing this, and it doesn't need professional instruction, and it doesn't need to be hard or off-putting. And, one hill at a time. The Bible itself is strange enough. The books that we've listed here are strange and involved enough. You don't need to be taking on, in addition to that, the idioms of 5 centuries ago. No, I would recommend fairly good modern translations, stuff that take that element out of the equation. And then once you've got this stuff under your belt, once you're starting to feel familiar with it and like it, and you will, some of it, I guarantee you will, then you can savor the King James absolutely all you want. No, the two versions I have here are the New International Version and the New American Standard. Either one of those will be fine. Either one of those they were compiled by a group of really good scholars, not quite as good as the men who made the King James, but still really, really good. And they have accessibility in mind, which is the key. So that's video number 1 in this starter kit. I'm afraid it's going to be quite a long starter kit, but if you don't like it, if you think the whole thing is just condescending by nature, then I won't do it. I'm not meaning to condescend. I've done this before many times with people who come to me and honestly say, I know you're not a snob. I know you don't look down on my reading, but you've read a lot more than I have, and I'd like a little help. Where should I start? What should I do? That's what I intend this to do. So if you're interested in that, I'll gladly go on. But for now, that's the end of this first one, is that the place to start, there are 2 places to start in the Western Canon, and the first one is the Bible. High time that you did. It's the most influential book that's ever been written. So get to these are the narrative parts, the rhetorically excellent parts. These will keep you clear of rote law giving. They'll keep you clear of dietary and societal restrictions. They'll keep you clear of for the most part, empty prophesying books where you can study them certainly, but you can't enjoy reading them. And sticks to the stories that matter, that you will encounter everywhere as you move forward in the Western Canon. So that's it. That's it for now. That's the Bible. And I'll try to remember to list the books down below in case any of you are interested. And if we go on, of course, we will go on to the other part. There are 2 places to start with the Western Canon. The first is the Bible. Second is Homer. So if you want, we'll go on to that next. You let me know. And I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.